Post tenebras lux, after darkness light. How's everyone doing? I see there's some talk about social media. Someone says the purge has begun. YouTube is deleting accounts. I don't know who you guys have in mind in particular. So maybe somebody will mention it. I know David just posted a video, so even though he knows his days are numbered, they aren't over yet. Solo Cristo says, I'm still sporting the neck beard. Yeah, so I shaved it off right after my debate with Shabir. But as I mentioned last time, David, a bundle of compassion, said I looked like a dork. So I grew it back. Hey, Carm, good to see you. Good to see everyone else as well. I see James is here. Broche is here. I don't know if I said your name right. Joel is here. Joel the Aussie. Binet. Solo Cristo. Air Church. All right. Good to see you all. All right. I don't really have much by way of announcement. Just a reminder for those of you that are interested in my upcoming debate with Dale Tuggy. I'll be debating Dr. Dale Tuggy on, does the book of Mark teach that Jesus is the one true God? That debate will take place on the Gospel Truth channel done by Marlon Wilson. Hey, Jamal, good to see you. Good to see you, Kaffir Linda Clark, and thank you, Jesus. Good to see you all in the chat. I have that debate coming up with Dr. Dale Tuggy. Really looking forward to that. Dr. Tuggy was also supposed to debate Dr. Edward Dalcor, good friend of mine, top-notch scholar, but Dale had his reasons for not wanting to do that debate. In any case, I won't comment on that right now. Perhaps I'll mention it and the reasons I find it interesting after my debate with Dale. I don't want to get old Dale too riled up before the debate. All right, so if you guys were here for my last live stream where, hey, Chloe girl, good to see you. My last live stream, we looked at Genesis 3:15 and specifically addressed the question of the identity of the serpent. I can't rehash all of that. If you didn't see it, go back and watch it. So I will be taking what we established in that lesson for granted to some degree. I might reiterate points here and there, but for the most part, as you know, if you listen to that, we went over like 100 slides, all sorts of verses, establishing not simply from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament, the fact that the serpent in Genesis really, in fact, does have in view what we now refer to as Satan. Right now, the Old Testament doesn't use the term Satan as a proper noun, but it does refer to Satan by various names. He's referred to elsewhere in the Old Testament as the serpent. He's referred to as the dragon. He's referred to as Leviathan. He's referred to as Belial. And this is significant because it shows us that what's going on in Genesis 3 is not simply a tale of why it is that human beings don't like snakes, generally speaking, at least out in the wild. And thank you, by the way, for the super chat, Dale. It says, shout out Sandy Gouveia, who's a new student of yours. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So we established that it's not just a tale of why it is that human beings don't like serpents. And this also provides impetus for viewing the prophecy in Genesis 3:15 of the serpent's head being crushed along messianic lines. Today, we're going to look specifically at the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15. Remember that God says to the serpent after he tempted the woman and she succumbed and then gave to her husband and he ate and also fell. That God said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your seed and hers, and he will crush your head and you will, or he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. Now, I didn't mention this before, but it's also relevant to establishing the fact that the identity of the serpent is actually a reference to Satan and not to simply to a serpent, an animal. Notice that the text in 3:15 says, of this future figure, it says, he will crush your head. Okay, it's specifically referring to the serpent who had tempted Eve. So if the one who's going to come in the future is going to crush his head, then this serpent must still be around at the time of his coming. That shows the longevity of the serpent, and therefore it indicates that we're not talking about any ordinary serpent. That also follows from the fact that the serpent spoke, the serpent was intelligent, the serpent was capable and malevolent enough to try and tempt Eve. So the serpent, as I said before, is really and truly being portrayed as an evil power, specifically, as the Old Testament says elsewhere, as the dragon, Leviathan, and even as Belial. Remember, we saw numerous references to a figure named Belial, which is connected in the Old Testament and in the New with the serpent, the dragon. But it speaks specifically of human beings being the seed of Belial, right? The sons of Belial, or men of Belial, of people having the thoughts of Belial. This shows that this evil figure has seed. Now, what's interesting is it's not referring to literal biological progeny or offspring. It doesn't mean, as some individuals have come up with in more modern times, it doesn't mean that Satan had relations with Eve and produced offspring through her. It's referring to biological offspring of Adam and Eve, progeny of the woman, who are identified with Satan. So they are spiritual offspring. The language there is metaphorical. And this is established among, besides other places, in reference to Eli's sons. Remember, it says that the sons of Eli, the sons of Belial, right? So it uses this appositional construction where it indicates that Eli, his physical progeny, were the spiritual offspring of Belial. Okay, so the seed of the serpent are not literal biological offspring through the serpent, but Eve's offspring who are spiritually identified with the serpent. All right, so what I want to do today is look specifically at the identity of the seed of the woman. And what I'm going to do, instead of picking on Rabbi Tobiah Singer, who I picked on last time, I'm going to look at Rabbi Michael Skobac. Some of you have probably heard of him. One thing I'll say about Michael Skobac, at least what I've seen from Skobac, he's not as obnoxious as Tobiah Singer. So even though I had no intention of making any scurrilous remarks regarding Tobiah Singer, I certainly won't have anything along those lines to say about Michael Skobac. But he is nevertheless wrong, and he has a number of things to say against the Messianic interpretation of this text. So since I have a lot to cover, let's get right into it. The first thing I'm going to play is just a clip from Michael Skobac that kind of sets things off. He makes a joke here, and so let's hear what Michael Skobac says.
And they refer to this passage in Genesis chapter 3 as the proto-evangelium. It's a fancy big word. They refer to this as the proto-evangelium. Don't try putting it on your bread. Which means that it's the first glimmer. It's the first glimmer of the Christian gospel found in the Hebrew Scriptures. So they will say that this is the first place in the entire Jewish Bible where you have a glimmer of the Christian message, of the gospel message.
Okay, so there's Rabbi Michael Skobac. And the reason I wanted to play that is not because he's telling us anything of any substance, but because he makes this little joke that might have sounded funny. He referred to the proto-evangelium and then said, don't try putting it on your bread. The reason I found this funny is because he's actually mispronouncing the word, which is not all that serious, right? The word is proto-evangelium, more literally euangelium, right, from the Greek. But it's not surprising that he wouldn't know the proper pronunciation of that word. But it actually sets us up for an observation I'm going to make in a little bit, where we see him actually butchering the Hebrew language. So I just wanted to draw attention to that. So here's the next clip that I want to play from Michael Skobac that really gets us into some more weightier issues.
Now, the first thing that I will say about these assertions by both the New Testament and Christian apologists is that if you just read this passage, and we just read it, there is absolutely nothing here, nothing, not one word, that says anything about a Messiah. This is, again, something that they are asserting, they're claiming, but there's nothing in the text itself to substantiate such an assertion. It's just a claim that they make.
All right, so Rabbi Skobac tells us it's just a claim that Christians make. It's not there in the text. And I'm actually trying to pull up my PowerPoint, but for some reason, I don't see it here. Let's see. Sorry, folks. I should have had this ready. All right, here it is. All right. So Michael Skobac says that there's nothing in the text that refers to the Messiah. Now, this mistake is the sort of thing that's made today in Christian circles by, I'm speaking extremely loosely here. I don't literally mean Christian circles, but those who profess to be Christians. When they say, unless you can find a word in the Bible or in a particular text, then you don't have the concept there either. The closest thing you get to Christians actually saying this are in the churches of Christ, right? They have this this statement, no creed but Christ, and where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible's silent, we are silent. And it's not that I disagree, at least with the prima facie meaning of that statement. The prima facie meaning of that statement is we believe what God says. We don't go beyond what is written or what is warranted by the text. Certainly, I'd agree with that. But the way churches of Christ understand that is that you don't use any terms that aren't found in the Bible. So words like Trinity, deity of Christ, incarnation, all these terms are out the window. That doesn't mean that all churches of Christ reject those doctrines, but there are doctrines that they would reject that are clearly biblical, even though some of the terminology used for those doctrines aren't found there. Grosser forms of this are found, of course, in those groups that do reject the Trinity, do reject the deity of Christ, the incarnation, Christ's preexistence, the fact that Christ is God the Son, because some of those terms aren't found in the Bible. But as everybody I think knows that's watching this channel, I hope you know, it's extremely simplistic to say if a term is not used in the Bible, then the concept isn't found there, right? Even the word Bible is not used to refer to the collection of 66 books that we now refer to as the Bible. The Greek word, biblos, is used in Scripture, but it's not used to refer specifically to the 66 books that comprise the canon. But nobody balks at using that term. There are people that will use, I have, what's his name? Anthony Buzzard's book over here. And it's a book against the Trinity. And one of the things he does in his book is he makes this argument. But then throughout the book, he continues to use words and phrases that aren't found in the Bible. He talks about the one person God repeatedly, the one person God of the Jews, the unipersonal God of the Old Testament, over and over again. All of these terms aren't found in the Bible. And we could easily, multiply terms that aren't used in the Bible that are used by all of these groups, these anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christian, anti-incarnational groups. Jehovah's Witnesses make reference to their meeting places as kingdom halls. Where does the Bible refer to kingdom halls? They refer to the Watchtower as Jehovah's theocratic organization. Where does it ever use the phrase theocratic organization? Where does it ever name, this organization, the Watchtower? I mean, on and on we could go. This sort of thing is extremely simplistic. Now, what makes this especially bad here, with respect to Genesis 3:15, either Michael Skobac doesn't know this, or he's being willfully ignorant. But when the idea of a Messiah in the Old Testament, the term Messiah, of course, means the anointed one. And the noun is used in various places, right? It does in various places refer to the Messiah. For example, Daniel 9 says that the Messiah will be cut off, right? It's referring to a specific individual there. But the whole concept of the anointed one stems from the Old Testament's expectation of a future figure who will embody all of the Old Testament's hopes regarding a future figure who will be the climax of Israel's anointed offices. Remember, Israel had 3 anointed offices: the offices of prophet, of priest, and of king. All of these were anointed offices. There are numerous references in the Old Testament to the anointing of priests, the anointing of kings, the anointing of prophets. Now, ordinarily, these offices in the Old Testament were separate. A person held one office, not 2 or 3. On very rare occasions, you'll find an individual who holds a specific office, sometimes being associated with the functions of another office. Right? This is very rare, but it's also very significant. What it's doing is it's pointing to the fact that in the future, there is going to be a figure who is going to embody all of these offices, and he's going to be the pinnacle, the goal towards which all of them are heading. Right? So, for example, when the Old Testament talks about a king, it's very clear that the Old Testament expects some future individual to be the king par excellence, the King of Kings, right? We have numerous promises to David that one of his future descendants would sit upon the throne, and he would sit upon that throne forever. You have the language of Psalm 2, where it speaks of the Messiah, the anointed one of David, from David. In fact, it's a Davidic psalm, but it's talking about the fact that there will be a future king who will rule all the nations. Remember in Psalm 2:7, he says, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations," or he said unto me, I will declare the decree of the Lord. He said to me, "You are my son. This day have I begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. Now, it's clear that the king, the anointed one in view here, is not David or any of the other descendants of David prior to the Messiah, because none of them ruled over all the nations of the earth. Moreover, later in the psalm, it says that the judges and kings of the earth are to kiss him, lest his wrath flare up and he destroy them. Right? So they're all to bow down to him. They're all to kiss him. This is also pointed out in Psalm 72 and Psalm 89 and Psalm 110, where the coming Davidic son is not only said to reign from God's right hand. So this is an especially exalted picture of the Messiah. He's not going to reign on earth, but more gloriously, he's going to reign from the heavenly Mount Zion, from the right hand of the Father. And in that same psalm, in verse 5, it says he will be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So in that psalm, he's referred to as both the coming king and Lord, as well as a priest. So it's extremely simplistic to say, because this passage doesn't use the word Messiah, that it's not talking about the Messiah. Many of the texts that talk about the Messiah, the fulfillment of these anointed offices, don't use that phraseology. But something else I want to point out here, let me share my screen real quick so you can see these slides. Michael Skobac is not even being very Jewish here, right? This isn't the sort of thing that earlier Jews, Second Temple Jews, would have said. If you look, for example, at the Targum of Onkelos, I'm only giving you part of it, by the way. I don't want you to be distracted by the other part right now. But here's what it says in 3:15. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will always remember what you did to him in the beginning, and you will watch for him to the end of time. Okay. Now, I'm going to quote other Targums here in a moment, but I just want to draw your attention to this interesting language here. The Targumim recognized that certain words in the Hebrew can go in more than one direction. And so when it says, for example, in Genesis 3:15, he will crush your head, the word for head is also a word that could be understood as referring to the beginning. And so when the text goes on to say, and you shall bruise him on the heel, they understand heel to refer to the end. So in other words, they're looking at this text as also including a hint of the time frame that's in view here. Now, what's interesting is when you look at other Targums, I want you to see what they do with this. So here's the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan on Genesis 3:15. It says, for them, however, meaning the seed of the woman, there will be a remedy, that is from the serpent's bite. But for you, the serpent, there will be no remedy. And they are to make peace in the end, in the days of King Messiah, of the King Messiah. So notice that Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, even though it doesn't use the phrase Messiah, sees this as a prophecy respecting the remedy that will be brought in the future, in the end, in the days of the King Messiah. Now, here's another Targum. This is Targum Neophiti, which does the same thing. It says, for her sons, however, there will be a remedy. But for you, O serpent, there will not be a remedy, since they are to make appeasement in the end, in the day of King Messiah. Now, why would they think that this language about the beginning and the end, especially the phrase the end or the end of days or what have you, somehow was a tip-off pointing to the King Messiah? Well, because throughout the Old Testament, it uses a phrase, specifically the end of days or the last days, and that phrase is associated with the time of Messiah's coming. So let me give you an example. Pardon me if that's not very big. I see I didn't make it bigger. Hope you can read that. But this is Genesis 49. So it's Jacob's prophetic words pronounced over his seed. He's about to die. And this is what it says in verse 1. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come." Okay, now the literal Hebrew phrase here means in the end of days or in the last days. Okay, so this prophecy spoken with respect to his sons, his 12 sons, has special reference to the end of days, the last days. So it literally should be translated that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the end of days. Okay. Now, in the same chapter, in verse 10, it has a well-known, well-recognized prophecy regarding the Messiah. It says in verse 10, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the nations." Now, this is remarkable already in Genesis, because it's talking about a ruler arising from Judah, right? One of Jacob's 12 sons, specifically from Judah, a ruler. And this ruler is envisioned as ruling over not simply Israel, right? Not simply over Judah, not simply over Israel, but over the nations, over the Goyim. So it's obviously talking about that same person later spoken of in the Psalms, Psalm 2, right? Psalm 72, Psalm 89, Psalm 110, the one who would reign from God's right hand over all the ends of the earth. Okay. So, and again, this is a text that was understood by Second Temple Jews as a messianic text. But again, the point here that I'm making is simply that the phrase end of days is associated with the time of Messiah's coming. This phrase is used numerous times in the Old Testament. Here is a clip just giving you that if you want to look them up. It's also used in Numbers 24, a text that I'm going to be quoting later. You'll possibly already recognize that as a oracle of Balaam, where he's referring to the star that arises out of Jacob. It's used in Deuteronomy 4, Isaiah 2, where it talks about the law going forth from Jerusalem and all nations streaming to it in the future. Not just one nation, not just Israel, but all nations streaming to Jerusalem. In Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 30, Jeremiah 48, numerous other texts make reference to the end of days or the last days. And many of these texts specifically contain a prophecy about the Messiah. So whenever you find that phrase, according to the rabbis, you're talking, even if it doesn't specifically mention the Messiah, since certain texts do mention the Messiah in conjunction with the end of days, it is legitimate to see that as pertaining to, in some way, the Messiah. Okay, but now let me just give you a couple of other quotes showing you that this was a well-established understanding in Jewish circles. So this is from Genesis Rabbah, and interestingly, this even comes from after the time of Jesus. So even though contemporary Jews who have an axe to grind don't want to admit that certain texts are messianic, they're Jews at the time during the Talmudic period. So post-Christian Jews who did have an axe to grind still couldn't get away from the fact that this was understood in a messianic sense. They were still holding on to at least certain rabbinic traditions that associated this text with the Messiah. In Genesis Rabbah, it says, Rabbi Tanchuma said, in the name of Rabbi Samuel, Eve had respect to that seed which is coming from another place. And who is this? This is the King Messiah. Now, here is, this is from Radak, and Radak is simply a way of referring to Rabbi David Kimchi, who was a medieval rabbi. And again, this is significant because he's a medieval rabbi, and he still hasn't shaken off this understanding of the prophecy. But this comes from his commentary on Habakkuk 3:13, where he's referring back, obviously, to Genesis 3:15. He says, as you went forth for the salvation of your people by the hands of Mashiach, meaning Messiah, the son of David, who shall wound Satan, who is the head, the king and prince of the house of the wicked. Now, notice, by the way, that he also takes that prophecy as he understands the serpent in Genesis 3 as a reference to Satan. Okay, so he doesn't take this as simply an etiological tale referring to literal serpents and why it is that human beings don't like serpents. All right, with that said, I'm going to play another clip from Michael Skobac, but let me just take a moment here and look at the chat, catch up with this chat. See if I missed anything. Anybody have any questions at this point with what I've said? Because we're going to get into the meat of the matter here. Any questions with what I said? I know there's a delay between what I'm saying and when you're hearing it. So any questions? Any questions in the chat regarding what I've just said? Okay, after we're done with the study, I'll open it up for some other questions. Yeah, so Solo Christo said, interesting how he made the connection between the serpent and Satan. Yes. And again, I mean, that's Rabbi David Kimchi, a medieval rabbi. Still, at the time of Kimchi, this was being understood in a messianic sense. But that's how it was understood in the Second Temple period. That's how it was understood by the Talmudic rabbis. So this is a firmly entrenched Jewish notion for good reason. I mean, we're going to see all sorts of good reasons momentarily, but let's just play a clip here from Michael Skobac to get the ball moving forward.
Christian apologists will use this passage to establish, again, their claim that as the Messiah, Jesus came to crush the head of the snake, who is seen as Satan. It's speaking about the ongoing hostility between humanity, and that's what the snake is being told here. The snake is being told that God is telling the snake there's going to be an ongoing hostility between you and your descendants, Mr. Snake, and Eve and her descendants. And we all know that all over the world, no matter where you go throughout history, human beings have had not the best of relationships with snakes.
Okay, one more clip along those lines, real quick.
So God is very simply here painting a picture of what is going to be the relationship between humanity in the future, who will be the descendants of Eve, and the snakes that will come in the future.
All right, so I just wanted you to see that this is the position of Michael Skobac. Now, if you recall my live stream last time, you also heard that from Rabbi Tobias Singer. So, according to these contemporary Jewish rabbis, quite contrary to ancient Jews and even to Talmudic and medieval Jews, this is simply a tale of why it is that human beings don't like snakes. Now, I want you just to take a step back here and consider what these guys are saying. Remember what's going on here in Genesis, or maybe maybe you're not remembering this. Maybe this is going to be the first time you're hearing this. But when you look at Genesis, the first chapters of the Bible are establishing the plot of the story. Right? You have the creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and then in chapter 3, you're told about the fall. The rest of the Bible is now talking about the aftermath of that. This is establishing the very plot of the book. It's explaining to us the problem and also the solution to the problem. So according to these rabbis, what they are ultimately really telling us, if they're consistent, is that the plot of the book, of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and of human history is this warfare between human beings and snakes. Now, if you've read your Bible and you've thought that that's the plot of the book, then you have colossally missed the point. That is most certainly not the point of the Bible. It's not the point of Genesis. It's not the point of the Torah. It's not the point of anything in the Old Testament. But that's essentially what they're telling you. That in the beginning, human beings had this weird encounter with some rogue snake, and now we don't like snakes down to the present day. Okay, but let's move on and listen to what I consider to be the more substantive arguments from Michael Skobac. And here's where he's going to start making his especially bad blunders.
But what gets many Christians very excited is that the Hebrew here, I don't have it in front of you, but the Hebrew here speaks of the zera, the seed of the woman. In the Christian Bible, in the book of Galatians, they make the strange assertion that the word seed, S-E-E-D, really refers to only one human being. Somehow, whenever the Bible uses the word zera, seed, it makes the strange assertion that it refers to one person. Now, the problem with that is quite serious for anyone that knows any Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, the word zera, seed, always means descendants in the plural.
Okay, so I hope you guys were paying attention. He points out that the word for seed in Hebrew, now sometimes it's translated seed, sometimes it's translated offspring. You'll recognize that in English, those are singular words, but they're also in English words that can be used in a collective sense, right? Think, for example, of the word fish, right? If I say I caught a fish, I'm referring to one fish, right? Thank you so much, Catherine Linda Clark. She says, the rabbi has to denounce the head crusher because they reject the Messiah. Accept Mary, and you are not a Jew anymore. All right, I'm not sure what the Mary reference is there, but maybe you're simply referring to the fact that Mary as the mother of Christ. But in any case, the word fish, if I say I caught a fish, it's obviously functioning there as a singular. I'm speaking about one fish. If I say I caught fish, you wouldn't know what I'm referring to. Am I using it? Well, there you would. If I say I caught fish, or if I say what are you having for dinner? I'm having fish for dinner. In that case, you don't know if I'm referring to one fish or many. If I say I caught some fish, then you know that I'm referring to many fish. All right. So I see a couple of super chats. I'll come back to those folks. Just want to finish this line of thought. But what Michael Skobac says here, and this is why I told you, I brought up the issue of him mispronouncing the word proto-evangelium, right? It's proto-evangelium, which shows he doesn't know how to pronounce the word. But he should know better when it comes to the meaning of this Hebrew word, the word zera. He didn't simply tell you that the word is singular and can function either as a singular or as a collective noun referring to a group of many. He told you that it always, always, always is used as a singular. Okay, let me play the clip again. So I want to make sure that you guys caught this.
But what gets many Christians very excited is that the Hebrew here, I don't have it in front of you, but the Hebrew here speaks of the zera, the seed of the woman. In the Christian Bible, in the book of Galatians, they make the strange assertion that the word seed, S-E-E-D, really refers to only one human being. Somehow, whenever the Bible uses the word zera, seed, it makes the strange assertion that it refers to one person. Now, the problem with that is quite serious for anyone that knows any Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, the word zera, seed, always means descendants in the plural.
Okay, so there you heard it again. He says the word zera in Hebrew is always plural. I mean, it always refers to a plurality, right? Always refers to descendants. It's never used in reference to a singular individual. And he specifically takes a shot here at Paul. Okay, so here's the passage from Paul that he's referring to. Okay, it comes from Galatians 3. In Galatians 3, Paul says, "Brethren, I speak in terms of human relations. Even though it is only a man's covenant, yet when it has been ratified, no one sets it aside or adds conditions to it. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ." So in context, Paul is referring to the issue of the law, and he's pointing out that the law came after the promises were made to Abraham, and they do not annul or disestablish that prior covenant or the promises that were contained there. But he specifically makes reference to the fact that it uses the term seed, and he says it's singular and it's referring to one, meaning Christ. So Rabbi Michael Skobac makes the outstanding claim that the term is never used in the singular. Okay. Now I'm going to help Michael Skobac out in a little bit, and then show why this doesn't, even helping him out doesn't, do anything to disestablish the Messianic interpretation of the text. But let me just show you several texts where the Hebrew word zera, seed, is used in the singular. So here's Paul in Galatians 3, right? He says, not to seeds, referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ. So here's Genesis 4, the very next chapter. It says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." Okay, so notice here, by the way, it's sort of a subtle point, but notice that it actually is using the word seed, or it's basically referring to, let me just make this point before making the subtle one. It literally refers to Seth here as her seed. And it's saying that he replaced Abel. In other words, Abel also was her seed. Okay? So there are two different individuals here, one explicitly, the other by implication, who are being referred to as her singular seed. Okay? In the very same book, in the very next chapter. I mean, it's incredible that a Hebrew rabbi would actually say that the word is always singular, never plural. Always plural, never singular. Here's another example. Genesis 15. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram also said, since you have not given me a seed, one who has been born in my house is heir to me. So notice, Abraham saying, or Abram at this point, his name hasn't been changed yet. Abram is telling the Lord, you're telling me that you're my shield, my great reward, but all of this is to no end because I don't have a seed to pass this all on to. Instead, I have Eliezer, right? Somebody born in my own house. He is going to inherit all of this. So Abram wants a seed, right? He's clearly referring to a specific child from his own loins instead of Eliezer, an individual. Okay. Genesis 21, another example in reference to Ishmael. It says, but God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and your slave woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac, your descendants, and literally the word there is seed, your descendants shall be named. And of the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. Okay. So in both cases, it uses the word seed. Now, what's interesting, if you pay close attention to the flow of the text here, in verse 12, it seems to be using the word seed in the plural to refer to a plurality of offspring, right? In verse 12, it says, for through Isaac your seed shall be named. So he's telling Isaac that your seed shall be named through Isaac, meaning the offspring of Isaac. But in verse 13, right after it, it very clearly uses it in reference to a singular individual, namely Ishmael. Of the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. So numerous times, Genesis itself refers to a singular individual as seed. Okay. Now, at this point, I'm going to break off the PowerPoint for a second. I find this astounding that here you have a rabbi making this claim. I mean, it just shows an incredible ignorance of Hebrew grammar. But now there's something else I have to point out, and I didn't get the clip for this. I intended to. I just forgot to take this clip out of the video of Michael Skobac. But what's interesting is, the question to me is, how could he possibly not know this, right? Does he really not know it? Is he really ignorant of this, or is there something else going on? Okay. Now, I'm not going to push too hard in the direction of saying that he's just being deceptive or anything like that. But it's clearly a colossal oversight. And the reason I say it's a colossal oversight is not only for the reasons I just gave you, but because at one point in his little diatribe against the Messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:15, he goes off on this tangent where he's talking about, he's claiming that certain Christians say that this passage prophesies the virgin birth, right? Because it says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and hers, right? So he's saying that some Christians, he says the generality of Christians, and I'm not saying there are no Christians who say this, but there are, he's pointing out that some people claim that this is a reference to the virgin birth because it says her seed. Now, literally, women do not have seed, right? So, but the word just means descendants, and it's not trying to talk about the woman's issue. It's obviously the man's issue, the man's seed through the woman. But so he goes on to point out that in Genesis 16, that God speaks of Ishmael as her seed in reference to Hagar. So he says, clearly this is not a reference to a virgin birth because she had Ishmael with Abraham. Right now, I agree with him. I agree with him that this is not explicitly making any reference to the virgin birth. We get that later, right? We get that later in prophecy. But notice what he quoted in Genesis 16. He referred to Ishmael as her seed. What does that mean regarding the word seed? It means that the word seed is being used in reference to a singular individual. Michael Skobac himself referred to that passage to discount the notion that this is referring to a virgin birth. So even though he says that it's never used in the singular, he quotes a text where it is used in the singular. So I just find this incredible. I mean, this is incredibly embarrassing, okay? So the word is used in the singular. But what about these texts that that Paul is referring to? Okay, because many people will point out that if you look at the text regarding the promise of a seed to Abraham, they do seem very clearly to be using the word seed in the plural. Right? Now, let me actually give you a clip from Michael Skobac here where he makes further reference to this.
God promises Abraham, if you just look up, for example, in the 17th chapter of Genesis, so God is always promising to Abraham he will have many descendants, and it says that it refers to them as his seed. So even though the word in English seed is in the singular, and zera also, zera, seed in Hebrew, is in the singular, but in context it always refers to a person's progeny, their descendants in the plural. For some reason, the writers of the Christian scriptures want to insist that it really refers to not a group of people, not progeny, descendants, but one.
Okay, so there he goes again, reiterating his point that the word zera is always in reference to a plurality of descendants. But he does give us a reference here to at least show that there are times when it's used in the plural. And clearly, Paul is referring back to the promises made to Abraham regarding the fact that he would be given seed. So what do we do with this? Is Rabbi Michael Skobac right and Paul wrong? Now, just hold off on us for a second before we look at these passages. I just want you to consider something. A lot of people, if they were to just hear that, they would stumble over this and they would think, well, Rabbi Michael Skobac is a Jew. He's a rabbi. He knows Hebrew, right? So, what do we do with that, right? If you don't know Hebrew, you might be stumbled by this. But there's always something that you should consider. I mean, I think a very basic observation that shouldn't cause you to just fall headlong because some Jewish person said something. Remember, Paul himself was a Jew, and he was a Jew who lived 2,000 years ago. Okay? He lived 2,000 years ago, long before Michael Skobac. Okay? Paul was an especially well-educated Jew. He had advanced in Judaism beyond many of his peers. And so the idea that because some Jewish person says something, then all of a sudden, we just sort of, my computer wants to do an update. No, thank you. The idea that, suddenly, our faith crumbles at this point. I mean, I just, I think Christians need to, because I've heard Christians, they're like, well, what do I do with this? This Jewish guy said this. Well, just remember who Paul was, right? He was no chump. And so, maybe there was something to what Paul was saying. Okay. Well, let's look at some of these passages in Genesis and see if perhaps the good rabbi from Damascus, who was educated in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel, maybe he knew what he was talking about. Okay. So it's going to take a bit to develop this, but let's look at some passages. So here's Genesis 13. It says, "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give it to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted." Okay. Now, in verse 15, literally the word for offspring is seed. So the text says, "For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed forever." Okay, so it's the term seed, and it's literally singular. Okay, now in my view, this text is referring to a specific individual. However, it seems like the next verse poses a problem. Okay, and this is the sort of thing that Michael Skobac is drawing attention to, because notice what it says in verse 16. And I'm replacing the word offspring with seed because that's the literal term that's used there. It says, "I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your seed also can be counted." Okay, clearly, verse 16 undeniably is referring to a plurality. It's a collective here. It's using the word seed in reference to a group of individuals, offspring, right? Okay, but now just keep in mind what I said, that I believe there's a shift taking place between verse 15 and verse 16. Now look at Genesis 17. In Genesis 17, it says, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." Okay. Now, here in verse 7, it says, "I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God to you and to your seed after you." Again, especially from verse 8, it would appear in verse 7, it says throughout their generations, but from verse 8 as well, it would seem clearly that this has reference to a plurality, a seed being used as a collective. "I will give to you and to your seed after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." Okay, so it uses the plural there. Now notice Genesis 22. Okay, remember I said I'm working up to something that I'm going to show you. Here's Genesis 22. It says, "Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Okay. But now notice this. In verse 17, it says, "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore." Okay. So here, very clearly, it's referring to the seed as a collective, including multiple people. Okay. But notice the last part of verse 17. It says, "Your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies." Okay. This phrase in Hebrew, "and your seed shall possess," the word, the phrase, the verb shall possess is a third masculine singular. Okay, so it has the vav conjunction. That's where you get the word and, right? And then because Hebrew word order is different, it comes later in the sentence, in the English sentence, but it literally says, he shall possess. Okay, so here the singular seed. Oops, hold on. Here the singular word seed is used with a singular verb that means he shall possess. Now you might say, well, what about the latter phrase where it says the gate of their enemies? Well, here the English translation drops the ball because the Hebrew word is once again singular. Okay, it literally means his enemies. It's a third masculine singular. So the verse literally reads, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed, he shall possess the gate of his enemies. Okay, so it switches from the use of seed as a collective, meaning many people, to the singular, and it says, he shall possess the gate of his enemies. So it's not just that God will give Abraham a multitude of descendants, but that there's one great descendant who is to come from among them who will possess the gate of his enemies. What does it mean to possess the gate of his enemies? The gate is the stronghold. It means that he's going to rule over the nations, right? The enemy nations of Israel, he is ultimately going to rule over. What is this but the same thing as those other prophecies that we've already looked at, right? Genesis 49, to him shall be the obedience of the nations. Psalm 2, he will rule them with a rod of iron, right? Ask of me and I'll make the nations your inheritance. What is this but a reference to Psalm 72 and 89 and 110 that Messiah will rule over the nations that hitherto, prior to the coming of Messiah, have been the enemies of his people. But don't miss that last statement in verse 18. Notice what it says. In your seed, it just got through referring to the seed in the singular, and says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, so this seed, contextually singular, the antecedent here is the singular seed who shall possess the gates of his enemies. It says, in your seed, that seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, look at Psalm 72. This is Psalm 72, the psalm that I've referenced now but not quoted. It's a messianic psalm. I'm not going to read the whole psalm, but look what it says in verse 17. This is an intertextual reference back to these passages in Genesis. It says, may his name, meaning the king, the Messiah, who's going to come from David, may his name endure forever, his name continue as long as the sun. May men be blessed in him. Let all nations call him blessed. So notice that all people will call him blessed and will be blessed in him. The psalmist very clearly understands this promise to Abraham the same way as that other rabbi from the first century named Paul, who understood the seed to have reference to a single individual, namely the Messiah, the King. What is David doing in Psalm 72, agreeing with Paul? Doesn't he know that Rabbi Michael Skobac in the 21st century would correct all of them on their Hebrew grammar and tell them that it doesn't refer to a specific individual? Oy vey. But look, by the way, at what it says earlier in Psalm 72 regarding the Messiah, the King who will bless the nations. It says, may he also rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and his enemies, lick the dust. what in the world does that phrase, lick the dust, refer back to? Now, I know some of you may not have seen my study earlier in this series on Messianic prophecy, where I talked about the Bible's way of referring back to earlier prophecies, where I talked about intertextuality. But here again, you have an example of this. That means that the Old Testament authors didn't say, I'm referring to Genesis 3:15. I'm referring to Genesis 22:18. I'm referring. The way they referred back to passages to readers who were familiar with them was by picking up significant key terms and phrases from earlier scriptures. And this would have tied these passages together. It would have said, this passage is to be understood in light of this other passage, and vice versa. So here, Psalm 72, referring back clearly to Genesis 3:15, to passages like Genesis 13, referring to the promise that God would give Abraham a seed, not simply a seed concerning many people, but a specific individual at the head of all of them, or climactically, who would rule over all the nations. Here it is referring back to Genesis 3:15, the reference to the serpent eating the dust as his punishment. And it says that Messiah is going to be the one, the king is going to be the one to cause his enemies to lick the dust. Okay, so it wasn't just Paul. And by the way, the same thing happens in Genesis 24. In Genesis 24:60, it says, they blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. Again, the English translation drops the ball. Okay, it is referring in the first instance to a plurality of descendants, obviously, right? It says, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s. But the next line, when it says, and may your seed possess the gate of those who hate them, it switches to the singular. And may your seed, singular, he possess, it's a singular verb. It has a embedded singular subject. It literally means he possess, but you don't put that in English, right? It says, may your singular seed, he possess the gate, and then it doesn't say of those who hate him, them in Hebrew. It says the gates of those who hate him. Okay, the word is singular. So you have numerous times a passage where it will use the word seed as a collective plural, or excuse me, it's a singular referring to a multiplicity contained within it, and then it will switch to the singular. This is done repeatedly in the Old Testament. Paul was no dummy. David before Paul was no dummy, right? Numerous other texts I could cite. Michael Skobac doesn't know his Hebrew, and I submit to you not only that Paul, but David in the Psalms is much better in terms of instructing you regarding Hebrew grammar. All right, so let me take a pause here, and first of all, address those earlier super chats. First of all, thank both of you. I think it was Jandy who gave me a super chat, and then the other super chat came with a question. I'm sorry, I forgot who gave it. I'll look back and see who gave me that, but I do remember the question. Okay, the question was: is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls relevant to Trinitarianism, and I think the notion of Messiah's deity and so forth? And here, the best I can do for you is say yes. However, I don't have those resources on hand to give you. So maybe next time, before I start whatever study I'm going to do next time, I'll give you some clips that show you this. But for now, I'm simply going to have to punt and say I'll have to do that next time. But there is reference to this. But of course, don't miss the fact that the Targums are Second Temple Jewish literature, and the Targums are chock full of references to God, His Word, and His Shekinah or glory also associated with his spirit, and referring to them, right? Not simply as him or he, but as them, and ascribing deity and personality to them, right? To God, his word, and his spirit. Okay, that is something found throughout the Targums, right? All right. Oh, yeah. So it was Joel Aussie. Okay. So thank you, Joel Aussie, for that super chat, for that question. All right. So do we have any questions on what we've discussed so far? Okay. Now, we need to go back to Genesis 3:15. Okay. So I told you I was going to help Michael Skobac out. Okay. You might have thought that I've already done that, because I did quote passages where the word seed is used in a collective sense. But I also showed you that those passages often move from the use of the term seed in reference to a multiplicity to the use of the term seed in reference to one particular individual. And I showed you not only how this is indicated in the grammar of the text, but also how this is clearly the interpretation given to it in later prophetic scripture, such as Psalm 72. But what about Genesis 3? Because here, the argument can actually be made, and it's much stronger, at least apparently, on the surface, and than what Michael Skobac has said. So let me share my screen again. All right, so here's Genesis 3:15. So you guys obviously already know the verse. I don't have to read it again. I am going to replace. I don't like the way the translations do that, where they put offspring. I think you should just stick to the term. Not that offspring is a bad translation. It does at least capture that ambiguity where it could be singular or plural, but it obscures the times when the word seed is used in other places and they don't use the term offspring, right? So it's just better, I think, to keep using the word seed every place where the word occurs. That way you can see when that term is being used and the different ways that it's being used, right? To translate it differently obscures that. But I want you to notice in verse 15, in standard translations, what it says. Okay, verse 15 says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman and between your seed and her seed. Okay. It goes on to say, because the question would be, does verse 15 use the word seed in a collective sense or in a singular sense in reference to an individual? Okay. Now, it's no problem for the Messianic interpretation to say that verse 15, the first part of it, is referring to a multiplicity, right? It is referring to seed as a collective term. But the verse goes on, as I've shown in other cases, to speak in the singular. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, what more competent Jewish anti-Messianic critics will say is that the word here, the pronoun who in Hebrew, which I have in red, it is a singular masculine pronoun, but there is no independent neuter pronoun in Hebrew. So sometimes the word he is used to refer to it, right? It is used to refer to, it doesn't always have to refer to a particular individual, okay? And so the argument goes that because the word seed used previously in the verse is used as a masculine singular collective noun, okay? The argument is that the word he is not to be understood so much as he here, but as it, it should be understood in a neuter sense, right? It's in other words, Okay, might be a little confusing for you if you don't know Hebrew. The idea is zera is grammatically masculine, the word for seed. It's grammatically masculine. But that doesn't mean it's being used. You can't confuse grammatical gender with actual gender, right? In other words, some of you might be familiar with other languages where every word has, every noun has a grammatical gender. Well, just think of a simple analogy. It's not the best, but I want everybody to follow along. But have you ever heard people refer to their car and they say, "Isn't she a beauty?" Or "I got her all cleaned up," or something like that? Notice how they're referring to their car as a she. They don't literally mean it's a she, right? Well, some languages will actually use nouns for things like car, where the word car is feminine, right? Not because it's a literal female, but just because the grammatical gender is feminine. So what the argument is here is that he, because it can function as a neuter term, is referring back to zera, understood as a collective noun, which would then be neuter. Okay, and so it should literally be translated according to these individuals as they. Okay, here's the Jewish Publication Society reflecting that understanding. They shall bruise thy head, in reference to the serpent, and thou, the serpent, shall bruise their heel. Okay, but here's what's interesting. Okay, I'll make further observations in a moment, but here's what it says in the Art Scroll Tanakh. This is another Jewish translation. In another Jewish translation, it actually retains the singular. Okay, so in the Art Scroll Tanakh, they actually retain the singular. Okay, they refuse to budge on this point. So what gives? Why do you have one Jewish translation rendering it as a plural and another rendering it as a singular? If it was so obviously to be understood in the way that I described, and that's reflected in the Jewish Publication Society's translation, why would these other Jews translate it in the singular? Okay, that's already telling, because remember, Jews are working against the Messianic interpretation, contemporary Jews. So the last thing they would do, if there was room around it, is render it this way. There has to be something about the language that pushes them in this direction. Now, interestingly, if you look at the Septuagint, and I realize that most of you won't be able to read the Septuagint, but interestingly, in the Septuagint, it uses the red letters there. That's the pronoun he. Okay, you have it in two forms, autos and autou. So autos is the nominative form, and autou is the genitive form. That just the different ending indicates the different function it has in the sentence, but it's the same word, right? Form only changed because of different function in the sentence. But the word is singular in the Septuagint. Okay, now why is this significant? The reason it's significant is for this reason. While you don't have a separate pronoun in Hebrew to express a neuter, okay, remember, the anti-Messianic argument here depends upon the fact that the word he in the Hebrew text, the pronoun, can be used as a neuter and therefore be translated either as it or they, right? They being understood in a neuter sense as well. But in Greek, there is a separate pronoun that indicates the neuter, okay? But they don't use it here. Okay? And these are Jewish people, right, before the coming of Christ, who are translating it here and insisting on the use of the singular. Now, what's of further significance is in Greek, okay, so that would give the translation, he will give, this is the literal translation of the Septuagint, he will give heed to your head, and you will give heed to his heel. I don't want to get sidetracked on why it uses the word heed, Basically, it means watch out for your head. It's talking about waiting for it as though to smite it and so forth. But the point here is that they understand this as a reference to a singular individual. But the reason that's so significant is not only because the word autos, right, this word here, not only because the word autos is masculine when they could have used in Greek a neuter, but they should have used the neuter if they were going to be grammatically correct with the Greek language. Okay, now follow what I'm saying here. In Greek, the pronoun should agree with its antecedent. The antecedent is spermatos, okay? And in Greek, it's a neuter noun. So if they wanted to use, if they were going to be grammatically correct, then they should have used the neuter noun, but they insisted on using a masculine noun. And why would they do that? Because the point is that there's something in the Hebrew that forces them to do this. Okay, remember, in Hebrew, the pronoun he can be used as a understood as a neuter, right? Functioning there as a neuter. But in Greek, the autos is not. It's clearly masculine, and it should be neuter if it's going to agree with the word seed, but they don't do that. And that shows that they're understanding it as a reference to a single individual. Okay. So it literally says, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Okay. But what else do we have in the Hebrew text? Not only does it say, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, but the Hebrew word yeshufka is once again a verb that has a embedded singular subject. It literally means he shall bruise your head. It does not say they shall bruise your head. Okay, so it's not just that the word he is in the singular here, which could be understood in a neuter sense, but that the verb itself uses the plural. It uses the singular masculine form of the verb that means he shall bruise your. And they would not do this, or the author of Genesis would not do this if he was trying to refer to the seed here in a collective sense. Okay. Now, there's another reason for understanding this in a messianic sense. Okay. Notice the verse says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman and between your seed, or offspring, and her offspring. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Remember, the Jewish interpretation says this is just talking about a warfare between human beings and snakes. Okay. I've pointed out that it's the serpent in Genesis is an actual evil entity, right? He's referred to as Belial. He's referred to as Leviathan. He's referred to as the dragon elsewhere in the Old Testament. It's clearly an individual, an evil entity. And in the New Testament, he is additionally called Satan, okay? That old serpent, the devil or the dragon in Revelation 12. But the Jewish interpretation says this just refers to snakes, okay? The word enmity is never used to refer to enmity between human beings and non-moral entities. It's always referring to a warfare between moral entities, agents, okay? Beings that have personhood, okay? So, for example, here's Numbers 35. Okay. In Numbers 35, it says, the avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred or hurled something at him, lying in wait so that he died, or in enmity struck him down with his hand so that he died, then he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He is a murderer. Okay. And then it goes on and it does the same thing in the next section. If he pushed him suddenly without enmity or hurled anything on him without lying in wait, and so on and so forth. Here, it's clearly referring to enmity between moral agents. The same thing is true in Ezekiel 25, where it says, "Thus says the Lord God, because the Philistines acted revengefully and took vengeance with malice of soul to destroy a never-ending enmity. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will stretch out my hand against the Philistines." So again, it's being used to refer to moral agents. Same thing is true in Ezekiel 35, verse 5. There's no question. I don't know why I put that back up there. I'm sorry. I guess I have a couple of wrong PowerPoints there. But there's no question that the word enmity refers to warfare between moral agents. So I want you to put everything together that we've seen so far. What we've seen is that the serpent in view in Genesis, from the last session particularly, the serpent is an actual evil agent. Okay, the serpent is an evil power, someone who can speak. Okay, somebody who tempted Adam and Eve, somebody who was obviously opposed to God and man, and therefore sought to bring mankind in rebellion against God. This enmity and his progeny are going to be at enmity with the woman and her seed. This agent is clearly not a natural agent. He's going to exist until the time when his head is crushed by this future seed. Okay, so this agent has longevity. Moreover, we've seen that the word seed can be used in both a collective sense and in the singular sense. But there are certain indications in the Hebrew grammar that necessitate understanding it in certain occasions as a singular. I've shown that in Genesis 3. In verse 15, it shifts to the singular. It uses the singular pronoun, which even the Septuagint understands as a reference to a singular individual, but it also uses it in conjunction with the singular verb, yeshuvka, right? He shall crush. We saw the same thing in other passages in Genesis 13, other passages where it switches from using it as a collective noun to using it as a singular. And it does the same sort of thing in the Hebrew, not only using singular pronouns, but singular verbs, just the sort of thing that it would do if it's insisting on this being an individual. So it simply isn't the case that this passage is just talking about a perpetual warfare between human beings and snakes. It's not simply talking about a multiplicity of descendants, but also of a specific individual who will crush the head of the serpent. And as we go through the Torah, this sense is borne out. He is going to possess the gates of his enemies. He is, according to Genesis 49, the one to whom the obedience of the nations belong. This is the trajectory of Genesis. The same author of Genesis 3:15 authored the rest of Genesis and the rest of the Torah, and he clearly shows that the trajectory of this is clearly that of an individual, right, in whom this is ultimately going to culminate. So there are many other things that I could say here along these lines. Actually, let me show you one other thing. This also comes from Moses. This is Numbers 24, and I don't have a slide for it, so I'm just going to type it in. Oops. Let me share my screen. Okay, so sharing my screen here. Let's get rid of that. All right, so this is, I'll make it as big as I can for you. This is Numbers 24, okay? And let's get rid of those little things that are in our way and distracting us. All right. In Numbers 24, it says, when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to see, to seek omens. Rather, he turned his attention toward the wilderness. And Balaam raised his eye and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. Then he took up his discourse and said, okay, so this is a discourse of Balaam. He's speaking by the Spirit of God. So we know this is authentic prophecy, right? Remember, Balaam is not otherwise portrayed as a righteous individual. He was a person who, he was a mercenary, man for hire. And if he could curse Israel, he would have cursed him, but he couldn't curse Israel. And so here we see that when he saw that that blessing Israel was God's good pleasure, he decides to sort of switch gears. And at this point, the Spirit of God comes upon him and causes him to prophesy. Now, I do want to point out, by the way, in verse 14, what it says. Notice what it says in verse 14 before we look at the prophecy. He says, so now I am, behold, I am going to my people, and I will advise you of what this people will do to your people in the days to come. That's the phrase that I quoted earlier that I said in Hebrew literally means in the end of days or in the last days. I pointed out that this phraseology refers to, in various passages, to the days of the coming of Messiah. Okay, so we shouldn't be surprised if we're looking in Numbers 24 and we find that it contains a messianic prophecy. So what happens when we go on in the prophecy? Okay, here's verse 5. Okay, and I'll really blow this one up if I can. It says, how pleasant are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from his buckets. Notice the singular. And his seed, notice, it's referring to a singular individual, will be by many waters. And his, in other words, let me back up for a second. It's talking about Jacob, right? It's saying water will flow from his buckets, okay? And then it refers back to Jacob, right? Water will flow from his buckets, Jacob's buckets. And then it says his seed. Whose seed? Jacob's seed, okay? His seed will be by many waters. Now, the question is Jacob's seed here a reference to a singular individual or to a multiplicity of individuals? Okay. Water will flow from his buckets, Jacob's buckets. His seed, Jacob's seed, will be by many waters, and his king. Okay, this is Hebrew parallelism. Okay. It says, his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt. He is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He will devour the nations who are his adversaries or enemies, and he will crush their bones and smash them with arrows. Okay? So notice it's talking about a individual, and it goes on in verse 9. He crouches, he lies down like a lion, and like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. Don't miss the intertextual references here. This is dripping with intertextual references, right? Notice it says he will crush their bones. Sound familiar? Genesis 3. It says he crouches, he lies down like a lion. Remember Genesis 49, where it says that to him, to Shiloh, belong the obedience of the nations, and it likens him to a lion and says he's crouching down like a lion. So it's referring back to Genesis 49. And then it says, blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. This individual seed the king that comes from Judah, this lion who will come from his loins, right? This is referring back to the promises made to Abraham regarding his seed, in whom all nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, the intertextual references here couldn't be more stacked and couldn't be more obvious. But notice what it goes on to say. Okay, in verse 17, it says, I see him, but not now. I look at him, but not near. A star shall appear from Jacob, a scepter shall arise from Israel. There's a reference to the scepter again. Genesis 49, the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Shiloh is a word which means the one of peace. Until Shiloh comes, to whom belongs the obedience of the nations. Here it's talking again about the seed of Jacob who will come, who will be king in Israel, who shall rule over the nations. He shall arise as like a star from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel and shall smash the forehead of Moab and overcome all the sons of Heth or Sheth. So, for multiple reasons, it's very clear that Genesis 3:15, according to the grammar of the text, as understood not just by me, but by ancient Jews, the authors of the Septuagint translation, as well as even some contemporary Jews, as witness the art scroll, the Tanakh, the art scroll, as well as witness the Targums of Onkelos, of Pseudo-Jonathan, of Neophiti. All of these recognize that the grammar points to the fact that we're dealing there with a singular individual. This is borne out by all that's going on in the context. It's referring to the serpent, the dragon, as a real evil entity, not a literal serpent. His head is going to be crushed. All these things put together, the intertextual references found in later prophecies, Genesis 49, Psalm 72, Numbers 24, all of these things show us that Moses himself and the later authors of the Bible take this as a reference to a singular individual. Okay, don't miss the fact that Genesis 49 is written by the same author. It shows us how he understood what he wrote in 3:15. Numbers 24 was written by Moses, the same author as 3:15 in Genesis, showing us how Moses understood the reference. Rabbi Michael Skobac, other contemporary Jews who say this is not a messianic prophecy, are going against the grammar of the verse. They're going against the context. They're going against the rest of the Torah and the Tanakh, the rest of the Old Testament. They're going against what ancient Jews understood, and they're most certain what they understood, and they're most certainly not standing on any kind of moral high ground when they disagree with Paul. Paul is firmly situated in historic Jewish understanding of what's going on with reference to the seed in the Old Testament. And so I'll conclude with that and see if anybody has any questions. I hope that was all clear. I know sometimes I might speak too fast. Sometimes I might speak in a discombobulated way. Sometimes I am more eloquent than others. Usually takes a heretic to bring it out of me. But Pedro says he came late. Yeah, you missed a lot, Pedro. All right, Sahi Luke says it was very clear. Thank you for that testimony. Thank you for that testimony. Yeah, so I mean, there are other things that we could look at. By the way, I could mention that I did another series. I didn't call it Messianic Prophecy, and I didn't finish it either, but I think I have 3 videos in that series where I was looking at Genesis 4, and I also talked about other things besides Genesis 4, but Genesis 5, but I was specifically looking at how those chapters show us that Eve was expecting a individual who would be the Redeemer, an individual who would be Savior. So that would be additional argumentation internal to the book of Genesis, the writings of Moses, showing that this was to be understood along individual lines. It was to be understood along messianic lines. Eve herself interpreted the prophecy as a reference to or a promise about a particular individual. But you'll have to go listen to those videos to see what I mean. But that's also true as reflected in the later genealogy given to us of Seth's descendants. Numerous indications in that genealogy show us that the patriarchs, or the antediluvians, those prior to the flood, all of them were anticipating the fulfillment of that seed. They were all looking forward to a future individual who would ultimately undo the curse and bring salvation to mankind. Okay. James B says, I guess it's back to the start. Yeah. Sorry for those that came late. But we did cover a lot of ground. So I see that one of my mods is asking Joshua Daniel why he isn't asking his questions now. Apparently somebody had questions when I wasn't looking at the chat. So let's see if I still have his question if I scroll back here. Remember, folks, when I look at StreamYard, it only retains the last like 5 or 10 minutes of the chats. Okay, so Joshua Daniel's just basically ignoring the points that I made. He's asking, he says the surrounding context is always talking of plural descendants. The whole point that I make, well, first of all, I established that the word zera can be used in the singular. The point that I made is, while these texts do refer to a multiplicity of descendants, they also shift quite dramatically and quite emphatically, indicating that it's now referring to an individual. Okay, there's simply no way around this grammatically. Okay, and you have to account for that. And you also have to account for it in a way that doesn't pit it against the rest of what Moses wrote. Moses understood this prophecy to find its ultimate fulfillment in a particular individual. Genesis 49, right, verses 8 through 12, he sees it being fulfilled in a particular individual. In Numbers 24, the entire chapter almost is referring to a specific future individual as the seed of Judah, or Judah, who is going to realize these Mosaic promises. Okay, you have to account for the fact that this is how David interpreted these passages. It would be in the particular individual, the Messiah, the Davidic king, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. You can't just skirt these things. Okay, it would be that particular individual that would bring blessings to the nations. Okay. So Joshua Daniel says, do not the early chapters of Isaiah use poetic language showing that the whole nation was referred to as an individual? Okay, so apparently Joshua hasn't even paid close attention to Isaiah. Okay, let me show you some fun facts regarding Isaiah, if that's where you want to go. Oh, he's an agnostic. Okay, that's fine. Let's do fun facts with Isaiah real quick. Because now remember, I don't deny that the term zera can be used as a collective, right? And my point is that it can also be used as a singular. And there are certain ways that the Hebrew text indicates when it's shifting from a collective sense to a individual sense. Now, he's bringing up another phenomena that you find in Isaiah, where you have the nation referred to as an individual, right? It's referred to as the servant of the Lord, for example, right? Let me give you some examples of that. Am I sharing my screen, by the way? Let me share my screen. So I share my screen. Let's go to Isaiah 42. Notice what it says. In Genesis, Isaiah 42. Blow it up here so everybody can see it. It says, "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bent reed he will not break off, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice on the earth, and the coastlands will wait for his law." Now, what a number of individuals will point out, especially Jews and then agnostics who pick up bad arguments from Jews like crumbs off a table or like a dog picks up fleas. What's often pointed out is that the phrase, my servant or servant of the Lord, is sometimes used in Isaiah in reference to the nation. In fact, let me show you in the very next chapter where this is the case. Okay, let me go to Isaiah 43. Here's Isaiah 43. Notice what it says. Blow it up again. Isaiah 43, the Lord says, "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen." Okay, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, and there will be none after me. I am the Lord, and there is no God besides me. It is I who have declared and saved and proclaimed, and there was no strange God among you. So you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and I am God from eternity. Okay, so it would seem very clear from Isaiah 43 that Israel is being referred to as God's servant, right? Israel is being referred to as God's servant. God says, "You are my witnesses," plural, declares the Lord, "and my servant whom I have chosen." So, is our agnostic friend here right? Is Joshua right? Does this mean that the servant of the Lord is, when we see it being used in the singular in the prior chapter, is simply a reference to Israel rather than to an individual? Okay, when it says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights, I have put my spirit upon him, he will bring forth justice to the nations." Okay, now I'm not going to get into all the grammar here because I suspect Joshua doesn't know Hebrew, otherwise he wouldn't have made the objections to what I had earlier pointed out. Quite painstakingly, I thought. But I'm going to point out something else that makes this undeniable. Isaiah, just like these seed passages in the Torah, in the rest of the Old Testament, switch from using it as a collective to using it as a reference to an individual. The same thing happens in Isaiah. Okay, this is replete throughout the Old Testament. It can use terms in a collective sense and also in a singular sense. Okay, now I'm going to show you how you can tell in certain passages when it's being used as a singular without even knowing grammar. Okay, I freely grant that in Isaiah 43 it's being used as a reference to the nation, right? But notice what happens. Okay, so Isaiah 42 is what's known as a servant song. Okay, there are 4 servant songs in Isaiah. And this isn't my claim. This is what all scholars point out. There are 4 servant songs. There's this one here in Isaiah 42. And a lot of this has to do with the structure of the verse in Hebrew and the way it's laid out and so forth. But this one in Isaiah 42. Another one in Isaiah 50. And then the other one is in Isaiah 52, verse 13, all the way through 53, verse 12. Okay. But what's the fourth one? Okay. We're going to go to the fourth. Well, it's not the fourth in order, but it's the fourth that I just mentioned. I mean, I didn't mention them in order. Follow what's happening here in the context. Watch what happens. In Isaiah 49, it says, "Listen to me, you islands, and pay attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named me. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he has concealed me. And he has also made me a sharpened arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel." Okay, now you might think, oh, that just proves the point. The servant is the nation. But watch what happens. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will show my glory. But I said, that's the servant talking, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in futility. Nevertheless, the justice due to me is with the Lord, and my reward is with my God. And now, says the Lord, who formed me from the womb. Watch what happens. Sorry, I got to get the whole verse in here. And now, says the Lord, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring back Jacob to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God is my strength. Wait a minute, what just happened? It went from referring to the servant as Israel to saying in verse 5, this is his reward. This is the reward of the servant who's called Israel. This is the reward. Now says the Lord, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring back Jacob. Who is Jacob? Jacob is a name for Israel, right? But it makes it clear to bring back Jacob to him so that Israel might be gathered to him. So wait a minute. This servant, Israel, is going to bring back Jacob or Israel to the Lord. So wait a minute. What's going on? Israel is bringing back Israel. The servant is bringing back the servant. Yes, right? Because the servant is being used in both a collective and in a individualistic sense. Notice what it goes on to say, by the way, in verse 6. He says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the protected ones of Israel. I shall also make you, a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. What did I show you regarding these passages regarding the seed throughout Genesis? Throughout the Torah, at least in Numbers 24, I could have shown you other references. I showed you that the promise regarding the future seed who would crush the serpent's head, through whom the nations would be blessed, that it switches from using the plural to using the singular. And it clearly refers to an individual, and that individual would be the one to whom the nations owe their obedience. Genesis 49:10. I showed that this is how David understood it in Psalm 72:17. He understood that this referred to a particular individual, the Messiah, in whom the nations would be blessed. Okay? He would be the one who would save the nations. Here you have the same thing being confirmed by Isaiah. Isaiah does the same exact thing that you find in the Torah and elsewhere in the Old Testament, but he does it using the equally flexible term servant. He uses it as a collective and to refer to an individual. So in answer to Joshua, yes, you're wrong. All right. Any other questions before we conclude, folks? I don't like to keep these too long because, actually, I could go longer if people had questions, but I realize that if you do a live stream for too long, watching them is prohibitive. I mean, people don't even start watching them because they think, oh, this is just too long. What happened? Did Joshua leave? All right. Looks like, oh, hey, grazie, Alcrego. Alcrego, it says, thank you, Anthony. You are always so well considered, and your presentations and debates are always jam-packed and worthy of note-taking. You and your obvious, rigorous behind-the-scenes efforts are very much appreciated. Yeah, and just so you know, I mean, I literally spent all day putting all these references in. In my mind, it just really helps to, get more out there. I think I said this last time, but it bears repeat, I guess, because I do spend a lot of time. I just want people to know that I spend a lot of time. I could easily sit here and just quote things to you. I could tell you to turn there in your Bibles. I could try to make somebody else. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people doing it that way. I'm just saying that in my case, this is what I do. So I spend a lot of time making this easier for all of you, and so that you can all look back at it and so forth. So thank you very much for the super chat. Oops, I got the wrong message up here. Giovanna says, Anthony, do you have any news of Hatun Tash? Yes, she texted me, she emailed me yesterday, which reminds me I have to respond to her. She emailed me yesterday. She is, her rights have been reinstated by YouTube, so she's allowed to do live streams again. I don't know if you guys knew, but she was not doing live streams for a while. She had to do pre-recorded sessions and then put them on YouTube because YouTube had suspended her rights. And then she asked me if I would do a live stream with her at the end of the month. The problem is she wants to do it on Saturday, but the time she wants to do it, I'm supposed to be debating Dale Tuggy. So we'll probably have to shift the time or else change the day that we're going to do it. So she's alive and well. She's out on the street. She's a free woman. And she's doing all right. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions, folks? Which is fine with me because I'm a hungry man. Truth Defenders, if he's here, can tell you that we like to eat. I like to eat. I'm sure everybody likes to eat, but without confessing to being a glutton, no, I'm kidding. I usually eat smaller meals, and I just I break it up a lot more, so I eat more often. It just helps my body process the sugar better. All right, so Joshua is telling us that such and such makes better sense of the historical context, as if, Joshua, I would assume you had some good comprehension of the historical context. Maybe I can pick up on this when we come back for another show, but briefly, let me say here, the passage is talking about Israel saving Israel. And it's talking about Israel saving the remnant of Israel. That's part of the problem that you have with these passages. I didn't quote all of them, but you can't say that the Israel who's saving Israel is just the remnant, because it's the remnant that's being saved. Okay. Moreover, the nation of Israel is not the savior of the nations. Okay. If you say that accounts for the historical context, when did Israel save the nations in that context? Okay. That's clearly not the historical context. Israel has never saved the nations. Okay. I can tell you who did save the nations. The Messiah, right? That's Israel's Old Testament hope, that the Messiah would be the one through whom the nations would be blessed. Again, this is found throughout the Old Testament. I gave numerous references for it. I shouldn't have to repeat them. By the way, Zone Fighter's here. I forgot to mention this. He said, Zone Fighter caught my attention because he left a comment on one of my videos where he was correcting me, basically telling me I'm adult. So I want to share this with you. First, let me take this comment off the screen. Here's the message from Zone Fighter. Okay. Zone Fighter says, "You made a common error. David did not kill Goliath with the stone from his sling. He killed Goliath with Goliath's own sword." Now, the reason I'm reading it this way is because of the way he's going to put it here. The stone only knocked Goliath out. Okay, so he didn't kill Goliath with his stone. He only knocked Goliath out. Everyone makes that mistake because they have not read the text close enough. Okay, or they have not read it at all. They let someone else tell them about it without checking it for themselves. Okay, so he's saying everyone makes that mistake. You've made the same mistake as everyone else, either because you haven't read it or because you've just listened to what other people told you. Now, he was gracious enough to give us his reason for thinking that this was wrong, and he is right. He quotes 1 Samuel 17:51. There you have it in the text. It should be clear and decisive, shouldn't it? It says, "Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it." Okay. And then he goes on to give me another thumping on the head. He says, "You should never say biblical story," okay, because the current generation thinks story means fiction. So when you say biblical story, they hear biblical fiction. They don't think true story or historical events. Okay, one thing at a time here. Let me first take this off the screen. Let me share my screen again. Okay. Now, I mean, I don't have any problem with people correcting me, so don't misunderstand this, folks. But I do think there should be a little bit of humility. You know, if you're going to correct somebody, do it humbly, because you might end up eating your words, and we all know you don't want that. I mean, I don't think you do. Let me show you 1 Samuel 17. So here's 1 Samuel 17, right? Let's go down. Let's go down to the relevant verses. Look what it says. Okay, this isn't Anthony making things up because he just listened to other people's like an idiot, or didn't read the text for himself or closely enough. "So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and the stone. He struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in David's hand." Uh-oh. Verse 50 says exactly what I said, exactly what Zone Fighter says it doesn't say. Okay. Now, it is true that verse 51 goes on to say that David cut off his head and killed him and so forth. But that's not the same thing as saying he didn't kill him by striking his head with a stone, which Zone Fighter explicitly contradicted. It's simply saying that David killed him, and to up the ante and add insult to injury, he cut off the man's head, right, and killed him. So there's just a reiteration of the term "killed" there, which doesn't require a denial of the previous reference to him being killed with the sword. Okay, that was fun, but I just wanted to point that out. All right. Thank you, folks. I hope the lesson was a blessing to you all. Thank you for the super chats, folks. Thank you to all of you who support me on a regular basis, either through PayPal or through Patreon. I am looking forward to the day when the support gets to the point where I can cease the night jobs and then have more time to prepare for these things, as well as doing select videos, shorter videos on specific topics and in a more concentrated way. So, all right, there's Joshua giving us more. Joshua's got to come back. Come back, Joshua. He thought, I thought it was Elhanan, right? He thinks he's being profound, bringing up stock, canned, atheist, bad Bible reading contradiction. So come back next time, Joshua, and get some more of your errors cleared up. All right, folks, have a good evening. God bless you all, and have a good night.